So like the core thesis that you've kind of been arguing, if I'm not mistaken, is like you're arguing that restricting access to the best American frontier models harms defenders more than attackers.
I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve the geopolitical coordination problem with China, to stop them from open sourcing their models. I think attackers are going to have these models, so it's really important that we give defenders the best models.
The attacker's own Claude Code moment is likely coming this year. And if that is true, if you said that, if it arrives on schedule, what should policymakers and defenders, kind of be wishing that they have done by then?
I think that it's going to become increasingly possible for attackers to use agents to exploit that. It's hard to say when and who's, but I think this will happen. Attackers are adopting agents.
What made you start with this problem or this focus on AI and security? And why do you think like that latent debt becomes the first thing attackers will also go after when they adopt AI?
So what I've noticed working in a security org is that at most companies, there's like a small security org.
Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Joshua Saxe. Joshua, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this chat for a while. I heard you at Unprompted. I think it was March of this year, if I believe. March, not February, if I'm not mistaken. And I had never met you before, obviously, just meeting you now and virtually. But you gave an excellent talk on AI and cybersecurity and so on then. I've been following your Substack ever since. You've been giving some awesome insights there on all things AI, machine learning, the dynamic between defenders and offensive malicious actors and so on. But for folks that don't know your background, haven't heard your talks or read your blogs, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah. So, I grew up around like the 2000 era, sort of teenage AI, like the teenage hacker youth culture. Not AI. It wasn't much AI around back then. So I grew up writing shellcode and exploits and network attack tools and stuff like that. And then I turned 18 and I quit security. I was involved I was a blackhat hacker and it felt like a good idea once I wasn't a minor anymore. Then I'm into music. I did music and history, and I was a high school teacher in LA inner city schools for a while. And then I just wound up back in tech. It's sort of hard to avoid tech. So I did a bunch of work for the defense and intelligence community. I sort of quickly got into applied math, and it wasn't really called AI back then. It was called machine learning and like Bayesian, like statistical modeling and stuff like that. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years is AI and security. So I sort of got into that when I went into tech. Long story short, I was at a startup. We exited to Sophos. I built and ran the machine learning program there. And then I wound up at Meta. I joined Meta at a great time. It was right before ChatGPT launched. And so I sort of landed as engineering security lead for Llama. And so worked on security post-training of Llama, security evals, built and sort of led the teams that did agent guardrailing, insecure code prevention, prompt injection prevention, did all that stuff. And then just a few months ago, left Meta to do a startup. So now I'm working at I've got two co-founders, and we're building a startup that's building what we see as the next generation of exposure and vulnerability management, but sort of conceived agentically. So yeah,
that's quite the journey from kind of black hat hacker to high school teacher to defense tech, big tech, and now your own startup. That's amazing. So you've been writing and quite extensively about this convergence of AI and cybersecurity and the national security implications, all those kind of things. As you said, you've been doing machine learning and security for quite a while with research leadership roles and so on, hands-on AI roles. Lately, you've been writing some of the most cited pieces, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to AI and cyber's collision. What pushed you to start, kind of making this diffuse or lose argument so forcefully right now?
Yeah, I think it's something. So when I was at Meta, I worked on. I think it was partly that when I was at Meta, I worked on Llama, and me and my colleagues working on Llama strongly believe that AI wants to be open source. I mean, these large language models are basically compressed representations of all of humanity's cultural and intellectual production over from the time in which we became literate and began doing cave paintings. Probably the LLMs are trained on those cave paintings, right? And they're trained on Socrates and Plato. That's humanity's bounty, so it just feels, I really strongly believe that, when we train, I definitely give credit to the labs for building this technology, but I also give credit to the rest of the human race that's generated the training data, and so I think this technology really wants to be free. I think that's one of my priors. I also just think, coming from a cybersecurity background, that we've seen this story before, right? It's like around offensive security tools, right? So tools like Metasploit, right, have been controversial, and there's been lots of freakouts, and from some quarters, right, around the idea that by releasing pen testing tools, open source, the sky's going to fall. Or in the 90s, it was cryptography, right? Like the idea was that we needed to export control the crypto algorithms that are now just the bread and butter of sort of running the internet in a secure way, and yes, we've seen the story play out before, and the way it's always come out is that being open with dual-use technologies actually has been foundational to the way we do security. And I think it's the same thing here. And I guess the third thing I'll say is just that even if I'm wrong that we shouldn't be open about these technologies, the cat's out of the bag. I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve the geopolitical coordination problem with China. To stop them from open sourcing their models. I think attackers are going to have these models, so it's really important that we give defenders the best models.
Yeah, it's funny, the initial kind of first point you made there around, kind of the origins of these training of these models. That's been kind of a point that's been made by, I don't want to say AI cynics, but people who push back on the labs, kind of condemning open source or discussing the risks of open source and the distillation conversation, right? They're saying it's kind of ironic that like the labs are arguing about distillation attacks on their models, given that the models were trained on, many other people's information and data to begin with. So that's something I've noticed in the conversation. So like the core thesis that you've kind of been arguing, if I'm not mistaken, is like you're arguing that restricting access to the best American frontier models harms defenders more than attackers. Like you made a blog post that the real threat, I think the title was like, is GLM 5.2, not Mythos, and that this is kind of a self-inflicted wound rather than a responsible safety measure. Why do you think that is? Can you break it down for folks? I know you talk about the inability to monitor, govern the usage of the models by attackers if you're kind of pushing them into the shadows, I guess you'd call it. And to me, like when I read your blog, a lot of my career has been in enterprise IT in the federal and the commercial space, and it feels like we should know this lesson. Like when you try to restrict and control and so on, like the usage still happens. You just don't know about it. You kind of proliferate shadow usage by this kind of behavior, and I feel like we're starting to see that play out here with AI and the national security kind of paradigm. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, so sorry, Chris, you're asking me to talk about though, like why? Right. So why being more open and less restrictive?
Why does restricting access to the frontier models harm defenders more than attackers? Basically? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say like my experience being in the sort of lab, sort of safety and security circles, like informally and I guess formally with my role at Meta, is that look, like. Without giving too much detail, every one of these labs has super smart people who are responsible for doing detection and response around how their APIs and their products are being used, right? So their teams monitoring usage of these. There's multiple layers of defense in the way that these models are protected. So first, there's inline guardrails that synchronously block people. We've all experienced this, right? In trying to get Fable to like talk about. A cybersecurity paper or something and having it refused. There's those inline guardrails, but then there's like detection and response style teams that are like monitoring all the traffic. And, those are the teams that publish the reports that many of us have looked at from, Anthropic and Microsoft and OpenAI, where they reveal that, nation state attackers are experimenting or using their models, experimenting with or using their models. So these models are guardrailed and monitored. So if you were to compare the situation of attackers trying to use those models and defenders trying to use those models, attackers are clearly at a disadvantage in using those models, right? So if I'm like a state-sponsored Iranian threat actor group, and I'm thinking, well, I'd like to use should I use Fable or should I use GLM 5.2? Use Fable, and some team in Anthropic might catch you in your tradecraft, right, and then send that directly to the NSA, right? We've seen those threat actors sometimes use those models, but they're at a big disadvantage in using those models. Whereas defenders aren't, right? Defenders are well supported. The labs are doing everything they can to, make sure those defenders are able to use those models. Well, actually, I wouldn't say they're doing everything they can, but defenders are an advantage in using those models for legitimate purposes. So I just think it's really important that we get those models into defenders' hands as fast as possible. They're also just, there isn't, like, for practical purposes, I just don't think there's that much of a delta or an important delta between like GLM 5.2 and Claude Fable in terms of what attackers are actually, we've observed attackers to actually be using the models for. Like, the attacker kill chain is not just finding very subtle bugs in SSHD, right? It's like the attacker kill chain involves like all sorts of activities, and when you sort of add them all up, like there's lots of reasons. If I was building an attacker organization, I would tell my leadership, like in a state-sponsored organization, I'd tell my leadership, like, we need to stand up some inference for GLM 5.2 so that we can fine-tune our way to guardrails, train on our own trajectories and like fine-tune on our own behavior. Like, there's all sorts of reasons they should be using that model to do their operations.
Yeah, it's funny because the what you guys talked about there, like, I feel like I listen to a lot of like AI, podcasts and dialogue in the industry, and I feel like the enterprise IT leaders are having this conversation right now, like where you don't need the frontier model to do everything, right? Like, you should be using other smaller, more affordable models. Like, there's been a kind of reverse around the whole quote unquote token maxing, and you're basically saying it's the same argument for cybersecurity. Like, maybe for some niche, small subset of malicious activities, you may need the frontier, but for an overwhelming majority of your tradecraft, you probably don't need the quote unquote best model. It's like you could probably do much. And like, going back to when I first heard you speak at Unprompted, the team at ISLE had given a talk there and a blog after that called The Jagged Frontier. And then there's others like Niels Provost and others who have written about like, the quote, using smaller open source models, older models, et cetera, to find 0 days and do all kinds of things. So it seems like this argument kind of falls over because it's not just restricted to just, the frontier models per se.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I find it like, I find the discussion in policy circles right now is confusing, and I feel like needs more. My sense is it needs more like cyber practitioner and expertise injected into it. Like, what I've noticed is there are a fair number of people who are involved in the discussions around like AI cyber national security policy who I think are like dramatically over-indexing on Mythos's ability to find bugs like somewhat faster, than whatever, open models, like given certain harnesses and given certain amounts of inference compute and this kind of thing. Like, whereas if you have to actually look at the picture of like what attackers are actually doing with AI, like, and I feel like I'm just repeating myself from before, but like, attackers are, the killer app so far for attackers, at least from what I've found in my research, has been like for AI has been social engineering, which you can. There's been models out for a very long time that allow you to, the open source models that allow you to do that. And there's all sorts of other stuff like just like target, like automating research on the target that you're pursuing, right? Like coding up malware, right? Which like there's many models that can do that, and this one, like the idea that we would block American companies and American leadership over like this one capability, which is maybe like 5% of what the models are useful for attackers, just seems very, very strange to me.
Yeah, I wanted to pull a thread a little bit on like your national security and defense background too, because as I watched this, like I was in the military, I spent a lot of time in the federal and defense space, and like since this administration came in, a big theme was like beat China in the AI race, make AI American AI like the pervasive international tech stack of the world, and it feels like the things that they're doing now are entirely counterintuitive and counterproductive to that goal, because now you're seeing so much conversation around open source AI, which of course predominantly comes from our biggest competitor in AI, China, and like you're hearing so many more conversations around like tech sovereignty, AI sovereignty, et cetera. Like, I can't help but feel like it's counterproductive, basically. How do you think of that?
I think it's really counterproductive. It's counterproductive for like a whole host of reasons, right? It's like so it's counterproductive, like we talked about, in terms of like the need to diffuse the best models among like we really want to get like Fable and Mythos and GPT 5.6, which was released but sounds like was delayed. These models are really good at AppSec tasks like finding subtle bugs in code. Like, we should be getting these models into the hands of the teams that are releasing releasing our software so that they can find the bugs and fix them before we launch. So it's counterproductive in that sense. It's counterproductive, I think, from a supply chain sense also. I'm not sure that this last month's worth of, to me, like policy errors made like an enormous impact with respect to supply chain risk, but like there's just the risk that the more we do this, the more we slow down the diffusion of the closed models offered by the American labs. The more enterprises are going to switch over to open weights Chinese models. I think that's going to happen. There's a variety of reasons why that's going to happen, but we're only sort of catalyzing that, by blocking model launches. And like we could talk more about how much of a supply chain risk that really is. I just think sort of the 10,000 foot view here though is that we probably don't want like the American economy just imagine a world in which like much of the American economy is dependent upon Chinese open weights models, and then we get into some conflict over Taiwan, over Taiwan. That's just like not like I think that's a dramatically bigger risk, than making Fable available to people, right now. So
yeah, I definitely agree with that, and it's ironic too because this past week there's conversations of I don't know how true it is, right? But in the media I saw some conversations around China exploring the idea of restricting their frontier not OpenAI, but open source models and so on, which is funny because it's like they're pulling an Uno reverse on us. That now while we concurrently become more dependent on their models, they could explore potentially restricting them, which I thought was funny. You also have been writing about obviously vulnerability management, which I want to get into with you, given that where your focus of your startup is. But you had a piece where you made an argument that exploits don't cause cyber attacks, and it kind of pushed against this vulnpocalypse narrative, right? Arguing that attackers act on incentives, not whatever capability just shipped. I'm curious, like when you think of that piece and your kind of thought around that in general, like which attacker constituencies do you think really get unblocked by AI's vulnerability discovery capability, and which ones were never really the bottleneck was finding bugs in the first place for them anyways?
Yeah, it's a good question. First I should say, this is a murky world, and we can only observe, some attacker behaviors, right? And it's hard to know exactly how all the various attacker groups are tooling up right now. First, as a preliminary to that, maybe it's worth pointing out, we've had sort of breakthrough technologies being released for a while, right? Like at least since 2022, open source, if you just assumed attackers would always immediately take and adopt the best technology, like we should have seen, catastrophic effects already. So for example, LLMs passed the Turing test, I think in 2022 or something like that, that's potentially extremely useful for social engineering. Attackers are adopting that in social engineering, but we haven't seen the kind of sky is falling kind of effect that many assumed.
I just wanted to jump in on that real quick because I had Gary Gamblin on, who's with FIRST, the organization that helps run CVEs and CNAs, et cetera. And they had put their mid-year projection out, and it did say, of course, we're on track for 70,000 CVEs and all these things, but there was a lot more nuance when you read their blog, basically saying, yes, CVEs are up, but exploitation is kind of flat. We haven't seen this follow on. It doesn't mean maybe it won't come in subsequent quarters and or years, but it's not here yet.
Yeah, and this stuff does matter, right? We do I think at least to my knowledge, the existence of multimodal LLMs and image generators has helped just reading North Korean groups that are doing social engineering, who don't speak good English, or for whom it's an easy tell, right? Broken English has long been an easy tell in social engineering. Not just North Korean groups, but many groups are benefiting from that, right? But it's more of we've been in there's some level of equilibrium, I think, that comes from attackers adopt this, the phishing detection companies are also adopting LLMs to do much better phishing detection than we were able to do with sort of 2010s era and AI, the situation. I'm all for. My whole, my professional life is dedicated to making security better, right? I'm all for making it better, but it hasn't been the kind of crisis that we've assumed. I think to answer your question specifically, any attacker constituency would benefit from having access to a zero-click RCE exploit against WhatsApp, right? There's no attacker group that would not accept would not enjoy having such a capability, right? Which the attacker constituencies will probably use AI to acquire access to such capabilities are nation states, right? It's I would expect, every like you wouldn't be doing your job if you were leading a national defense cyber organization if you weren't trying to do that right now. But in those cases, it's like just because they get those capabilities. I'm not saying so. That's a real issue we should be concerned about. But I think we should also bear in mind just because they get those capabilities doesn't mean they're immediately going to use them. In the same way that just because we have some pretty scary weapons doesn't mean we're going to go use those, and there's a lot of geopolitical complexity to what's going to happen there, and so I don't know. I guess I'm just saying there's some nuance there.
Yeah, I was actually you teed it up for the following question perfectly. Is like there's a bit of nuance in terms of the ROI of adopting AI. To your point, like there's geopolitics in the nation state, but I'm talking about from the attacker and defender perspective, like, and even in the enterprise sense, like everyone's kind of debating like ROI of AI and usage and adoption, like. Say that your kind of core argument is like we need to be adopting this faster than the attackers, right? To kind of win the race or kind of keep up and so on. Like, what does that look like in practice? Whether you like look at a SOC and SecOps or vulnerability management or AppSec, like where are defenders and vendors like best served in terms of adopting AI right now when you look at the landscape? I know like vuln management, for example, is one area you're really heavily kind of focused on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, like I found like so before I did the startup, I was overall tech lead for AI for security at Meta. So I was involved in applying AI to a lot of different areas. I mean, this is like not the most inspired answer, but like we were by the time I left, like at the end of February, I mean, we were seeing uplift almost everywhere, from applying AI. I think almost any cyber team could benefit from, really leaning into AI right now. Places where I was particularly inspired. So access management, and this is something we're working on at the startup also. Like, most organizations have a tremendous amount of over permissioning, in terms of who has access to what, often to a scary degree, right? And like, there isn't really in a large organization. I think there's no good human solution and no good rule-based solution to that, because you really need business and social and technical context to know who should have access to what. I think that's an area where applying AI is urgent and important. I think that SOC automation. We're not working on that at the startup, but we saw everybody's seeing, I think, a good dividend from applying AI to SOC automation. You can investigate a lot of you can automate a lot of the rote investigation work, and I think that's only going to get better. With AI. I mean, the stuff we're working on at the startup, and of course, I would say this, but I think is the most important, which is why we're working on it. Which is like burning down just the mountain of security technical debt that every large organization basically has. I mean, like my experience working in the security world is like people burn down their critical security risks pretty well, but anything that's below critical, just has a high chance of just sort of accumulating. I mean, which is why when you like hire a pen testing team, right, like they tend to find a way to get in, and it's usually not through some fancy means, right? So I mean, like what I would say is like the most important thing is to figure out a way to find, to get AI to help us like change the equation there such that, I mean, I think for security teams pre-AI, it just wasn't possible to burn down that security tech debt. And I think that it's going to become increasingly possible for attackers to use agents to exploit that. It's hard to say when and who's who, but I think this will happen. Attackers are adopting agents, and so we just need to find a way to do that with agents. So when I say security tech debt, I mean open vulnerabilities that we know exist that we haven't closed, like open admin portals, that you could that don't have MFA and you could brute force, that are open, like old dev servers that are just somebody left dangling out there, like those kinds of like boring old security risks. I think need to get burned down.
Yeah, it's all the low hanging fruit, and it's like the quote that hackers don't hack in, they log in, like things like that. Like every organization is sitting on hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities in their backlog that just have been pushed to the next sprint. I do want to keep going down the path of your startup and vuln management with you, but I had a question I was curious about, given your background in, ML and AI safety and things like that, like with the Fable redeployment, they went into detail in the blog about classifiers and how they kind of over-indexed on the classifier here to mitigate risk and get the model re-released and so on. And as you pointed out, like it often can, like you can even ask it about something trivial and it will block you or kind of downgrade you. I'm curious from like your experience in that, like how do you apply these classifiers and or guardrails without hindering like legitimate usage? It seems like it's hard to do that. Like it's like you're trying to, impact the malicious actors using it for nefarious purposes, but at the same time, you're just pissing off a bunch of defenders and vulnerability researchers because it kind of limits the utility of the model at the same time.
Yeah, it's a really hard problem. Yeah, I mean, I can say publicly, like we worked on classifiers like that at Meta, and like we had this Purple Llama program where we actually open sourced many of these safety classifiers. Yeah, I can say so. Okay, one huge challenge, which I think anybody who's tried to use Fable for security tasks will recognize, is that security is just an inherently dual-use domain. So almost anything that you want to do with the model that involves security, could be considered dual use, right? Like at our startup, we're creating vulnerability discovery tools, right? So it's like basically we can't use Fable for that because that's dual use. So I mean, there's just there's a very low theoretical ceiling on your ability to block attackers I'm not saying this very well, but like without blocking defenders, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like if you're going to block attackers, you're going to block defenders with these guardrails. I mean, I guess in the limit, right, you could have your guardrails go out and sort of like look at the entire conversation history of everything that Chris has ever said to Anthropic and like see, is he really, well-intentioned or is he not? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I'm not super optimistic about those kinds of approaches.
Yeah, it just seems like a really tricky thing to solve because as it's like attackers will pretend to be defenders or researchers, et cetera, in their activities to get the model to cooperate with them or provide a capability. And then like, maybe they act, benign or non-maliciously for some period of time to get trusted, and then they do something malicious. Like it's just so complicated. That's why I was curious. It seems like it's a really hard thing. There's no perfect answer for that, basically, it seems like. So, sticking with the startup, though, you guys soft launched the company, as you talked about, kind of reimagining vulnerability management, exposure management with agents, built around, kind of burning down the mountain of security technical debt that most organizations have that we just talked about. What made you start with this problem or this focus on AI and security? And why do you think like that latent debt becomes the first thing attackers will also go after when they adopt AI?
Yeah, I mean, so what I've noticed working in a security org is that, so I think most companies, so it was like this at Meta, but I think it's like this at most companies. Like there's like a small security org, and then let's take like a software product company, and then there's like a huge engineering org, right? And the engineering org, just by design and incentives, like is not primarily concerned with security. They're concerned with shipping product, but the security org is, and so the security org. And then there's like an IT org also, which is standing up infrastructure, and like they're not primarily concerned with security. So you've got 3% of the organization, which is typically not the most empowered, finding weaknesses that they don't actually for whom finding weaknesses, but then unable to fix them because it's these other orgs that actually have control over the fix. So what ends up happening is you have at least in big tech, it's like you've got these very highly paid, well-trained, expert security engineers who are sort of reduced to just nagging people in other orgs to fix issues, and just chasing people down constantly and trying to politic their way into getting things fixed. Yeah, it feels like this is an obvious problem that people tend to avoid tackling head on because it's less sexy, than finding a new 0 day or something like that. But I mean, based on attacker behavior, has to get solved. Based on sort of what you said, Chris. Attackers don't hack and they log in. This kind of thing, right? It feels like it feels like now's the time that we can do something really new here because we have agents that they can understand the technical context of a bug. They can understand the business context of what bugs really matter, and not just bugs, but misconfigurations and infrastructure problems and this kind of thing. But then they can also actually manage the communications with the owners, and then they can own the verification of the fix. So the way we're designing our platform is Our platform owns issue discovery, issue triage, and then issue comms with like IT and engineering owners of an issue. And then does agent-to-agent communication with, like, so if an engineer is using Claude Code or Codex, like we have an MCP plugin where it communicates with our agent and sort of guides them and like pair programs with them around like how you possibly fix this issue. And then the engineer's agent can like ask our agent to like check if the thing is fixed, right? And then so the CISO org will sort of own verifying that the thing is fixed, but then sort of like work with the engineer's agent. So like, I don't know, it just feels like there's something here, like around like sort of shortcutting like all the pain that I experienced at Meta and previous companies, and like actually making it easy and delightful to like get security issues fixed, where like an engineer doesn't have to like spend half their day, right? They can spend 10 minutes, and the security engineer or IT security person doesn't have to nag people, right? Because like that's an agent-to-agent comms thing, or the agent can ping the person automatically, and that sort of thing. So, anyways, that was like a long spiel.
Yeah, no, I'm equally as excited about it because I've spent a lot of my career in AppSec and vuln management, and like you described it so well. It's like you spend an inordinate amount of your time not on technical security work, but just going around trying to build relationship, build rapport, get trust, get buy-in, get people to act on things that you found, or get them to kind of burn down this technical debt. So if we can. And it kind of aligns with like there was a broader thesis last year, I think it was, last year, where it was like services as a software, right? Like leveraging software to do labor. And you're kind of you're using that kind of context here with vuln management, exposure management, of kind of putting the agents to work to go burn down these technical security backlogs, right? And that's longstanding been a problem. And as we talked about, like there's so much of it out there already in these organizations that attackers can take advantage of. So it seems like the most logical place to start. So I'm excited to see what you all build and definitely in this space too. So just to bring things full circle as we round out the conversation here, like you and others have spoke about, you think that, if I'm not mistaken, you said this in some of the articles, that there's like a structural advantage in some way for defenders, where we have, more defenders than attackers, far more compute, more legitimate data about our own environments and so on. Like, do you think that advantage is real and is it durable? Or is it, do you think that organizational friction and bureaucracy will kind of squander that advantage for us?
Yeah, I think this is like a really complex question, and it's like very hard to predict where things are going to land now that AI is sort of changing the basis on which we're sort of doing security. I mean, a few thoughts. So like, one, I think the outcome, like how secure we are 10 years from now or something, is partly a political and business decision, around trade-offs, right? I mean, like companies get to pick where they sit on the operating curve between shipping fast and shipping securely. I think that's not going to change, and like they're going to get to dial, how much labor and token spend they're going to put in security versus their bottom line. Those kind of, so some of that's out of our hands, right? As well, at least out of my hands, as a security professional. I do think, though, I am optimistic. I've got a mix of feelings. So the reasons for optimism are that I think we'll soon have AI in the next few years that can sort of surveil every log line, that's emitted, from, all of our software and IT components, across an enterprise, right? Like I think we can have a level of security surveillance, right, of what's happening in our enterprise that's just, would seem like a miracle to people, who got started in security, 10 or 20 years ago, right? Like, I also think, just the fact there's a structural advantage in AI security capabilities in that you can find and fix the bugs before you ship the software. Like you don't have to expose it to the attacker until you spend lots of tokens, right, finding and fixing bugs. And yeah, there's a lot more, in terms of like who's interested in finding and fixing bugs in the Linux kernel or something. Yeah, there's like 1,000 times more people interested in finding and fixing the bugs than there are in finding and exploiting them, if it's just a question of tokens, right, it feels like we should figure out the inter-organizational politics, and like whatever, like community structures to like make sure that happens, so I think there's a ton of opportunity, for our generation and security.
Yeah, I agree with you. A few things you said there is, one is like, there's always been this saying that under enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And like, of course we haven't had enough eyeballs, but with agents and tokens, like maybe that paradigm changes. And then of course it is a bit of I don't want to say a tricky or nuanced answer, but there's a lot of other things aside from the tech, as you point out, like, bureaucracy, organizational dynamics, incentives, like, yes, we can spend more time to fix all the bugs before we ship software, but that means maybe delayed speed to market and not being a competitor on a new feature. And like, so there's so much that goes into this, but I think that overall it's going to be a net positive in the long term. It's just going to be, maybe it'll be a little bit painful before we get there. And that takes me to my last question for you. If in reading all your blogs and so on, I think you had made a comment that the attacker's own Claude Code moment is likely coming this year. And if that is true, if you said that, if it arrives on schedule, what should policymakers and defenders kind of be wishing that they have done by then? If you could force like one institutional change today, kind of what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I think I'd probably have to reflect offline about like the one policy change, but I think a general accelerationist sort of vibe around AI adoption, like especially in the more like in the highly strategic but slower moving places in our society, like in government and DoD and even IC. I would say like I think this is extremely important. I think I'm not sure how much policymakers can do here, but I really hope that the American AI industry has an answer to Chinese open weights models in the form of our own open weights models that can compete. I think that's it's amazing how much I think open weights models have done ever since Llama and the early open weights models, and now in terms of like creating a culture of like tinkering and hacking and innovation, and like that's always been the lifeblood of security, I think, from like the 90s or before on. I mean, security is like, America is a center of excellence for security in the world, I think, because of that culture of openness and sort of innovation and hacking. And I think open weights models ultimately need to be part of that. And then I hope that the leading AI labs also embrace the idea that like diffusion is like the primary thing right now, and I hope we don't have more, like, I hope we don't see sort of larger and more impactful versions of what we saw with the sort of Mythos and GPT 5.6 episode. I hope we see the opposite, right, where we sort of rush these models out so that they can be used by defenders.
Yeah, I think / hope that we've maybe learned our lesson given the backlash and like the kind of industry dialogue that happened after that. I'm optimistic there, and I agree with you on the American open source. Like that's been an argument many people are making. Like maybe it'll be NVIDIA or whomever, but like there will be American alternatives hopefully that are on par with the Chinese leading open source models out there. So Josh, thanks so much for jumping on here, man. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy your blogs and your reading.
Likewise.
For people that don't follow him on Substack, please do. And I look forward to seeing what you guys build and follow your journey on the startup.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.